So, this is my critique of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey based on the ancient epic poem by Homer. For background, Odysseus, who is played by Matt Damon in the movie, is married to Penelope, played by Anne Hathaway, and they live in Ithaca, one of the Greek states. He goes off to war, leaving Penelope and their infant son Telemachus. The reason for the war, called the Trojan War, is that Paris, who is a prince of Troy, either abducted or eloped with Helen, the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Menelaus then calls on the other Greek kings to honor an oath they had sworn to protect Helen's marriage. So a coalition of Greek kingdoms sailed to Troy to bring Helen back. The war lasts 10 years. It ends when the Greeks use the famous Trojan horse to sneak soldiers into Troy at night, leading to the city's destruction. And of course, Helen is played by Lupita Nyongo and is the cause of a lot of controversy prior to the film's opening, or rather, her casting as Helen caused a lot of controversy prior to the film's opening. I am guessing not so much after. It is one of literature's great tragedies. What begins as a dispute over one woman ultimately becomes a catastrophic war that destroys an entire civilization. And because there's a lot going on, I'm just going to, kind of go into a little bit more detail in terms of the background. So, the Odyssey was written around 750 BC, the story of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, trying to get home after fighting the Trojan War. Although the war lasts 10 years, it takes him another 10 years to return because he angers the sea god Poseidon and then faces countless dangers along the way. Meanwhile, at home, his wife Penelope is besieged by wealthy suitors who believe Odysseus is dead and they want to marry her and take his kingdom. So, as the action of the story begins, their son Telemachus, who is now around, 19 or 20 years old, sets out to learn whether his father is alive. When Odysseus finally returns, he disguises himself as a beggar. He reunites with his son, he proves his identity, defeats the suitors. He's finally reunited with Penelope. And the movie is more or less faithful to the overall plot. Of course, like any other adaptation, Nolan takes certain liberties with the story, and in his Odyssey, he includes elements from other Greek epics, such as the Aeneid, which was written about 700 years after the Odyssey, and the Iliad. The Iliad actually describes the end of the Trojan War, so the action takes place before the Odyssey, and they are thought of together as sort of a two-part epic. One standout change in Christopher Nolan's iteration, for example, is the character Sinon, played by Elliot Page, who appears in another version of the Trojan War story as told in the Aeneid. All that to say, the director makes certain decisions in the film to tell the story the way he wants to tell it. So put a pin in that. The length of the movie was long. It was 2 hours and 53 minutes. Could have used an intermission, and I don't say that lightly as someone who saw both Oppenheimer and Killers of the Flower Moon. So in terms of going over the film, I'm gonna start with the visuals. The visuals were beautiful. The set design, the costumes, on point. Just gorgeous. It's an epic film, and so just a lot of even the construction of like the Trojan horse. A lot of that was really, really very, very beautiful. And it just reminds us that as long as people are telling stories, the big screen and movie theaters will always be necessary. You lose a lot watching things on the small screen, particularly in films full of grandeur and spectacle, as the Odyssey obviously is. I will say, though, that like a lot of films, there are certain times that the scenes were kind of dark. Um, and it seems like not a big deal until you think about how much it cost to make this movie and the skills of Christopher Nolan. So I guess he shot some of them dark on purpose, but I found them more distracting rather than enhancing the film. In terms of the sound, I would say that the music or the score, except at the very end, where perhaps it might, it's the most important place for it to have been, it was good, not great. Near the end, the score did a lot of work. It did convey a lot of emotion and did some of the emotional heavy lifting in some of the scenes, particularly, when it gets really dramatic when Odysseus, he returns to Ithaca, and it helps to dramatize some of the ensuing conflicts when he does. Acting wise, I felt the acting overall was also okay. For me, there were only two standout performances. Robert Pattinson as Antinous was great. He was very convincing as a cowardly, selfish, cold hearted villain. I mean, he played it to a T. His performance was very consistent, throughout every scene that we saw him in. To me, the best actor in the film was John Leguizamo. He was the heart of the film, and to me, he represented kind of the hopes and the struggles of the, normal everyday people of Ithaca, and all that they endured in Odysseus's absence. His character was very devoted to Odysseus, and he was also old and disabled, just kind of adding to another layer to the work, that Leguizamo had to do, and did very well, in my opinion. His character is also a good contrast, in my opinion, to Tom Holland as Telemachus, because Telemachus is, first of all, young when we meet him in the film. He's like 19 years old, but he doesn't even remember his father. Remember, the Odysseus left when he was a baby, when he went off to war. So Telemachus knows what other people have told him. He does believe his father to be a hero, but he has no firsthand knowledge of the man. Now, Leguizamo's character, Emmaus, remembers Odysseus. He clings to actual memories of Odysseus. He knows he's a hero. He feels the pain of what Ithaca was, before Odysseus left, and what it is now. So Leguizamo, in my opinion, incredible. Other than that, I would say everyone was, serviceable, except, as I said, Pattinson. Corey Hawkins was also okay. He didn't have a huge role, but large enough role to paint a very clear picture of the character of the man that he portrayed, and I think that he was very effective, when all is said and done. In terms of the themes of the film, there were many. One great thing about literature, whether you like the story or not, there are so many issues that the characters grapple with. And if you pay attention, so many lessons to learn. One thing this film made me, as a black woman living in America, who loves movies and TV, it did make me think about the scarcity of films featuring black people in strategic conflict. I thought about it, made me think about how black filmmakers create to entertain, to educate. When it comes to black American life, it's almost as if, we're trying to always show people who we are, right? Show our humanity, so entertain and educate. But they don't make films to inspire. And of course, that's partly structural and, kind of out of their hands. But at this point, I think that We have a lot more freedom to choose to try to make films like that. And I think it's out of maybe habit that more of those films are not, there isn't even an attempt to make them, to make films that make people leave the theater with a heightened sense of respect for their own identity and a desire to make the effort to preserve their dignity as human beings. I think movies like The Odyssey, they do that for mainstream audiences. And, they tell the same stories over and over. So, where is the 100th version of Shaka Zulu or the 100th story about Nat Turner trying to, liberate slaves? I mean, heck, where's the second or third version? So it really made me think about that while I was watching it. Another thing that stands out in terms of theme is destiny and the gods and power. And of course, at the heart of Greek myth is the concept of the gods. I think Odysseus drives home the point that there are actions that you, as a human being, you might feel righteous about, that humans have their own ideas about fairness and justice. But ultimately, if the gods don't agree and they warn you not to take certain actions and you don't listen, you're going to pay. And what this film also dramatizes is that not only do you pay, but your family pays and your community suffer the consequences as much or more than you. So think before you speak, think before you act, and heed what the gods have said. I also felt the concept of the gods is sort of a macro version of the concept of power. Those who hold the power make the rules, and they make them for their convenience and to advance their idea about how the world should be organized and how the world works. Go against them and you'll pay. So now the question becomes, should you go ahead and do the deed, that might anger the powers that be, and pay the price if what you are fighting for is justice or freedom? That's a question that I think we each need to answer for ourselves. So those are the two biggest, or yeah, three biggest themes that struck out to me. But like I said, there are plenty of others in the film that are worthy of consideration. So, in terms of what I mainly was interested in terms of film, was of course the depiction of Helen by Lupita Nyongo. I've been a student of what I like to call the golden age of diversity long enough to know that the controversy around her casting as Helen of Troy would be used to draw publicity and maybe would bring some incremental progress, but that the actual role might likely fit right into the same old racist, anti black stereotypes, just dressed up in beautiful gowns, beautiful gowns. If you know, you know. Anyway, let me start with how the Odyssey actually treats black men. Overall, I would say badly. And I'm not saying that it's Nolan's fault per se. I think he's just telling the story, in his way while doing his part to advance diversity and inclusion. But I think this callous, indifferent, almost passive aggressive form of inclusion is something that black actors need to reckon with. You have to ask that question, is a role worth taking if it digs black people into a deeper hole and makes the world even more anti black? Is it okay to leave your scruples at the casting room door just for a paycheck? Because that's kind of where I am with this movie, despite, from a technical and even a narrative standpoint, it's a great film. But of course, I think for people of color, it can't just be about that, right? Nothing is ever just what it is, especially when it comes to culture. So, if I remember correctly, there are about three or four black male characters in the movie. Only one had more than one line, and that was Corey Hawkins, who played Polybus. He was one of the suitors at the palace, angling to, get to Penelope. He was also Antinous' right hand man, and like I mentioned before, Antinous was played by Robert Pattinson. One of the other black male characters, and I say that with quotation marks, he was also a suitor because they showed him at the palace, but he was just an extra and he was literally just kind of shown on screen just to be shown getting killed on screen. The other two black men were on Odysseus's crew. I believe one of them had, like an on screen line, but he was killed on screen by like one of the giants. And the other one was just showing like shooting his arrow at the enemies during the war. And I don't remember if they showed him being killed later on. I do remember after the film thinking that all of the black men that I saw were killed on screen, but maybe I'm not sure if that one was. Um, so I think I mentioned this before in another criticism, maybe of All Her Fault. But many black characters in mainstream vehicles are characters who do not impact the narrative, who, if they cut them from the film, there would be no impact on the story, right? So ultimately, I found their presence in this film more harmful than not. I mean, like I said, most are shown being brutally killed on screen with nothing to kind of balance that depiction in the minds of the viewers. Now, Corey Hawkins does have quite a few lines. However, he is the cruelest character in the film by far, Polybus. And Polybus's cruelty is drawn out in dialogue as well as in his on screen actions. He's helping all the other jerks eat Penelope out of house and home while breathing down her neck to marry them, even though, she's loyally waiting for her husband to return from war. They show him on screen kicking an old dog, and not just a dog, not a vicious pit bull or anything, but this really old kind of sickly dog. And he hurts him. They show it on screen. He mocks a poor beggar in the most callous way. He attacks Odysseus's young son in his own home. He is cruel to the old blind character played by John Leguizamo. So I mean, there were at so many different points where they kind of drove it home that, this guy is a sociopath. He doesn't bat an eye to any kind of villainy. Now, are there white villains? Yes, but even they are not quite as vicious as Polybus. And even if there were larger than life heroes played by white characters to balance it out. So, in terms of the black male characterization and representation, I would say thumbs down. Did this guy, as an actor, as an artist, do a good job playing this role? Yes, he did. Now on to the black women. Well, there was only one, but she played two roles. So Lupita Nyongo, because of all the racist hatred, when they announced her as playing Helen, we know that she played Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, right? The most beautiful woman. But Lupita also played Helen's sister, Clytemnestra, and they were both shown as on-screen characters. So she played a dual character. And I know some people count Zendaya as black. I did want to sort of address this. And I do think that it's a much more nuanced thing than many of us want to admit. how far her blackness goes in each project that she does, but I primarily see Zendaya as a biracial woman, albeit one of African ancestry. To me, her phenotype is very mixed, and I primarily perceive her that way, and I consider her and her characters mixed in most of the roles she chooses, including this one. So I do consider Lupita as like the lone black actress in this film. Anyway, I haven't been on social media much since the movie came out, but I would hazard a guess that all the hoopla and all the hollering died down when people saw the film and understood that though Nolan cast Lupita as Helen, he still, for the most part, had white supremacy's back. Helen had very few lines, and before she was even on screen, her integrity and her morality was in question. And by her white counterpart, Penelope. You know, she is the one who said that Helen, who, if you remember, is married to Menelaus, may not have actually been kidnapped after all, but simply ran away with her lover. Throughout the almost 3 hour film, Penelope's integrity is never for a moment cast into doubt, and she in fact shows incredible loyalty and integrity to her marriage. When we do meet Helen, she's at a party, or maybe it was a banquet. She's seated beside her husband and others, at this long table. And the shot, like many others, is dark, but here it does definitely serve a dramatic purpose. Because as soon as her husband introduces her to Telemachus, as the face that launched 1,000 ships, he grabs her, by her chin, and he, kind of turns her face around so that she faces Telemachus and the audience. And we realize that half of her face is, in fact, seriously scarred. And the legendary beauty is then cast into doubt. It's almost mockingly done, both by the character and by the production. So it's like a dual layer. She then has one or two lines in which she's like angrily hissing to her husband what she believes to be the real reason for the war, and that her kidnapping was a mere pretext for something else, right? More of like a political power grab. So you guessed it, her characterization is angry. And we don't see much more of Helen, and we learn nothing about her as a woman, as a person. So even if you wanted to kind of argue that, her beauty was her inner beauty or whatever you might want to say, you as an audience member could not, because she's given absolutely no interiority. The disfigurement of her face was a choice made by the director, because the source material doesn't describe Helen being scarred or disfigured in any way. So Nolan cast Lupita only to effectively diminish the idea of a black woman in possession of great beauty. We don't see any affection between Helen and Menelaus, her husband, and there is no real understanding given as to the dynamics of their marriage, although he doesn't seem to love her, nor she him. And it's a failure because it's basically a 3 hour movie, and it was a choice not to give 1 minute to the audience to understand more about Helen, to understand more about her marriage, especially when they found time to try to humanize, like, Circe the witch, who turned everyone into a pig. And they humanized her by giving just a veiled reference to her having maybe been a victim in the past, by giving her a sister. I mean, just a couple of lines, and it gave her more dimensions. But none of that was given or afforded to the character of Helen. Helen is called a beauty, but is shown with disfigurement. She is in this interracial marriage, which appears to be loveless. And the only other lines that Helen gets is when Telemachus, who is again Odysseus' son, when he's leaving after visiting them and looking for his father, she hastily whispers to him that he should tell his mother that she's sorry for causing the war. And Telemachus doesn't even react, and he didn't tell his mother a thing. So it's like Helen doesn't even matter, he didn't even respect her enough to relay her message, and she is, she's a queen. So I think that this production did a lot to, as I said before, kind of diminish her. And on the subject of Helen's guilt or feelings of guilt, which is part of the source material, but the time for the audience to have understood her guilt, I think, was when Telemachus first arrived at the dinner party. Helen is meeting Odysseus' son for the first time, who is now a grown man, who never knowing his father. I mean, he's journeying, he's like desperately looking for his father. And so, a 5-second reaction shot where the audience saw her guilt as she first saw him and understood in a very real terms what it cost his family would have humanized her and communicated that aspect of the story to me much more effectively. And I also want to point out that it was also a choice because he doesn't have to use every bit of the source material. So it was also a choice of Nolan's to include the characterization of Helen as the cause of all the problems. As if that wasn't bad enough, Nyongo also played Clytemnestra, who is Helen's twin sister. Now, Clytemnestra gets really great lighting compared to Helen. When we meet her, it's all in flashbacks, but she is in gorgeous sunlight. She's in this rich, colorful fabric, gorgeous hair. She's smiling. We see her warmly greeting her husband as he returns from the war. He's smiling. She's hugging him. She brings him into the bedchamber, begins to undress him, but immediately attacks and viciously murders him in cold blood. And she is shown on screen snarling at him with her teeth bared, holding on to the bloody knife. Now, they did give a couple seconds of backstory. Her husband, before he went off to the war, sacrificed their daughter to win favor from the gods. And so she's angry at him. And she lashes out in murderous anger. However, we are not privy to Clytemnestra's agony. We're not privy to her grief. We don't see how she may have agonized over her decision about what to do about her anger at her husband. We are not told, which is in source material, that Clytemnestra was a competent and intelligent ruler during all of the years her husband was away. So, we're also told through Menelaus that her son murders her to avenge his father's death. And we're told that she plotted her husband's murder over many years with her lover. And so, like Helen, she's depicted as lacking integrity. She's unfaithful and, two-faced, a betrayer, with no real kind of human context for it. And Penelope, Odysseus' wife, played, of course, by Anne Hathaway, is directed and written in stark contrast to Helen and Clytemnestra. No liberties are taken with the source material to give her the quote unquote complexity they love to give black women characters. Penelope is steadfast and loyal. She is shown being a mom on screen. There isn't even the hint that she ever seriously considered moving on with her life after her husband was gone for almost 2 decades. That was a choice made by the writers and the director. And audiences need to keep that in mind when viewing projects like this. I will say that Nolan, even before this film, is famously bad or known to be famously bad at writing female characters with substance and agency and interiority. He's just not great at that, and that might have been part of the problem. But my opinion is it went much further than that in the careless way in which both Helen and Clytemnestra were written, and the way the characters were directed. So, what's the takeaway for me? Ultimately, Nolan helped raise awareness of Black presence in ancient Europe, not just as servants. So, for people who were unaware of that, this was a good thing in a very narrow way. But I think in every other way, I came away feeling that this casting, or the collective casting, if you want, of all the Black characters were a mockery, basically, and a way to, in fact, and I don't want to say a way to, because I don't know if it was deliberate or not, but but effectively reinforced ideas about white supremacy. The Black characters were at best irrelevant, and I think at worst symbols of the worst in human weakness. So that's it. Those are my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts about representation in the Odyssey, and if you feel there need to be more projects showing Black people, kind of being strategic about their own progress, their own liberation, if you will. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.